Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. I'm Nicolas Veron. It's my pleasure to introduce this new session of financial statements at the Peterson Institute. And we actually had a session on basically the same theme exactly 2 years ago. And with the first speaker being the same speaker, William Wright. So I'm very grateful to William for doing it again after a little bit more experience of Brexit. William studied modern history at Merton College in Oxford in the early 90s, and he was at King's College in London. He also did an international executive program at INSEAD in 2007. He worked initially in the City of London and in financial journalism with a distinguished early career as one of the founding staff members of Financial News in 1996. He then became editor of Financial News, was instrumental in the sale of that outfit to the Wall Street Journal in 2007 and became its managing director in 2009. In 2014, a bit less than 10 years ago, William started his own shop, New Financial, which was, I have to say, impeccable timing with reference to Brexit. You just had time to get going before the going got what it was in 2016. And New Financial has become one of the main sources of insight and expertise and information for the transformation of the financial sector, not just in the UK, but also in the EU and beyond in the wake of Brexit in particular. Caroline Atkinson was born in Washington, D.C., but she grew up in the UK, so nobody is better qualified to observe what we are going to talk about today. She also studied at Oxford philosophy, economics, political science. Then she also went into journalism at the Washington Post, The Economist, The Times of London. In 1994, she joined the Bank of England in London, so moved to the policy world as special advisor on financial stability and market regulation. And then in 1997, she crossed the Atlantic to join the US Treasury, working in international monetary and financial policy as advisor to Treasury Secretaries Bob Rubin and Larry Summers, now the vice chairman of the Peterson Institute, and until the end of the Clinton administration. She was then at the Council on Foreign Relations at Stonebridge International, now Old White Stonebridge. And in 2005, she joined the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and she then became its Director of External Relations. In 2011, she then went back to the US executive branch at the White House under the Obama administration as assistant to the president for international economic relations and deputy national secretary advisor for foreign trade, which also is the role of Sherpa for the G7, G8, G20 meetings. And she stayed there until I think the end of the Obama administration. So just leaving just before Brexit, you didn't have a hand in that, Caroline. You're not the culprit. Caroline Atkinson then was the head of global head of policy at Google until 2018. She also became a board member of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the most important thing, and is involved in a number of other roles as a global strategist for Rock Creek Advisors here in Washington, D.C., as a board member at the Center for Global Development, a trustee of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, back in London, and at the Peterson Institute. I should mention that you're not only a board member, but a member of our executive committee, which makes you a key person in this organization. Enough from me, over to you, William.
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you for the kind introduction and also the kind invitation to rejoin Peterson Institute to catch up after a couple of years on the impact of Brexit. It's been a long time since anybody actually mentioned to me, reminded me that I went to Merton. I did actually, for my sins, overlap with a certain Elizabeth Truss at Merton in the early 1990s. but we were not close friends, and I have absolutely no responsibility whatsoever for what happened last year. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Joining us today, my name is William Wright. As Nicola said, I'm the founder and managing director of New Financial, a think tank that makes the case for bigger and better capital markets in Europe. So today, I just want to go through a few key themes on the impact of Brexit. Firstly, looking at the measurable impact in terms of relocations and jobs moving from the city, the shift in market activity in foreign exchange, derivatives, equities, and some potential impact on jobs in the UK itself. And then looking at what happens next with a particular focus on the reform process in the UK and the outlook for closer cooperation, excuse me, between the UK and the EU in banking and finance. So let's start with the relocations that we've been able to identify from the city to the EU in response to Brexit. So we've identified nearly 450 financial services firms in the UK that have moved somewhere in the EU in response to Brexit. Now, I should stress these numbers are from 2021, but I don't think there will have been any significant shift since then. At that time, we identified 7,500 jobs that had already been affected, either relocations or local hires. But we think that is A, a very low estimate, B, more today, and C, will continue to increase in future. The chart on the left shows the wide distribution of relocations to different financial centers. And some of the key messages that come through: Dublin is the winner in terms of the number of moves, Frankfurt by the value of assets. But what we're really beginning to see here is that Paris is the longer term winner in terms of jobs on the move as a result of Brexit. Also, there's a very clear sector bias behind these relocations. Now, on the right, this is a chart from the same presentation 2 years ago. We think it's the purest single measure of Brexit. The pie chart on top shows where banks from outside the EU, US, Chinese, Japanese banks, and so on, choose to locate the 4 trillion euros or so in assets of their operations in the EU. And as of the end of 2019, when the UK was still part of the EU, 3/4 of these assets were located in the UK, and just 1/4 in the rest of the EU. Now, since then, the ECB doesn't publish these stats anymore, and not in a form where we can make a direct comparison. But we know that at least 450 billion euros in bank assets are being transferred or have been transferred from the UK to the EU 27 by the big 5 US banks alone, which takes the split closer to 65-35, with more relocations yet to be confirmed. So let's have a look at some of the measurable shifts in activity. Now, one snapshot, and it's only a snapshot, is the Triennial Survey by the Bank for International Settlements of OTC derivatives and FX trading that was published a few months ago. The dotted grey line on these charts is the UK's share of EU 28 activity over the past 25 years. And the blue line is the UK's share of global activity in these markets over the same period. And what you can see very...
Sorry for interrupting, William, but indeed, the caption is not entirely correct because it's EU 28, not EU 27, but I guess that...
Oh, I'm so sorry. I finally got used to pointing out, finally got used to the fact that the UK's actually left, and then I get it wrong when I needed not to. But in both cases, what you can see, there's strong growth over the 2 decades before Brexit and a marked decline since 2019, the last Triennial Survey. Let's compare, to be clear, however, the UK is still the dominant, or the city is still the dominant financial centre in Europe, despite this shift. These charts compare the UK's share of EU 28 activity with France and Germany over the past 25 years. And despite the drop since Brexit, activity in the UK is still 6 times bigger than France and Germany combined in derivatives and 8 times larger in foreign exchange. But before anybody in the UK gets complacent about this, it's worth zooming in on the actual changes in market share. And what this chart shows is the changes in market share in 4 selected markets where we have direct, consistent, comparable data before and after Brexit. On the left, in the trading of EU-listed equities, the UK has gone from over 40% of activity to roughly 0 since Brexit, and most of that has gone to Amsterdam. FX trading has held up quite well, but the UK has lost 1/8 of its market share in OTC derivatives in just 3 years, and a fifth of its share in euro-denominated derivatives. When you look at these numbers from a global level, what we see is that that shift has mainly gone to Frankfurt and to Paris, not to Singapore or to New York. Now, we've also found some early evidence that we're not seeing a Brexit dividend for financial services in the UK. The solid blue line on this chart shows the number of jobs in UK financial services over the past decade. On the one hand, it's great to see that they've actually increased in absolute terms since the referendum, although they're flat in absolute terms since the end of the transition period in December 2020. But if the financial services sector had kept up with the jobs growth in the wider economy since the referendum and since the UK left the EU, there would be something like 52,000 additional jobs in banking and finance in the UK than there are today. Now, there are lots of reasons for this. We're not saying this is all Brexit, but clearly we think that Brexit is part of the answer here. So finally, looking at what happens next. On the question of potential closer cooperation, and I know Catherine, I think, is going to be talking more on the politics of this in a few moments. On this question of closer cooperation between the UK and EU in financial services, it's good to see close day-to-day cooperation between supervisors and regulators, but they are inevitably constrained by politics. We keep being told there are no prospects of closer cooperation or a more formal structure for cooperation until the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol is resolved. And there may or there may not be a window for that to be achieved in the next few months. As you know, the UK is working furiously on post-Brexit reforms for banking and finance. And last month, it published the Edinburgh Reform Package of more than 30 different proposals. Now, it's very encouraging to see the political pivot in this reform process from deregulation and Big Bang 2.0 under Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng to a more measured and incremental set of reforms. But I think the key point in the reform process is that it highlights what we call parallel divergence. Both the UK and the EU are reviewing many of the same dossiers for many of the same reasons, but they're coming to slightly different conclusions, slightly different solutions on a different time frame. So they're diverging broadly in the same direction, but it's divergence all the same, adding to the existing fragmentation in European banking and finance. In the longer term, we think there is more dislocation and shifts in activity to come. We're currently in the second of 3 phases of the post-Brexit impact on the city. The first was the city preparing for Brexit. The second is the city fleshing out the relocations that it had already started, and the EU ensuring that firms meet the obligations that they had agreed. But the third phase could see the EU applying more pressure in different sectors, perhaps clearing and asset management for more relocations down the line. And it could also see the role of London as the default location for international investment in future being challenged, with more jobs perhaps being located in other financial centers in Europe. But overall, we see the longer term impact of Brexit on the city as binary and very negative in a few key sectors, but perhaps overstated at an industry-wide level. Brexit is a self-inflicted injury for the City of London, but it's not terminal. It's more like rewinding the clock 20 years in terms of the footprint and distribution of markets activity across Europe. And for the foreseeable future, the city will continue to be the dominant financial center in Europe, but increasingly less the dominant financial center for Europe. So thank you for your time, and thank you again, Nicolas, for the invitation to share some of those headline thoughts. I very much look forward to the discussion and any questions coming up. Thank you.
Thanks so much, William. That was superb. Caroline.
Thanks very much. And as Nicolas says, that was a superb outline, or with deep information. So as William said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics, but starting off from where he was, which is, this is a lose-lose proposition. Both the EU and the UK, when his presentation focused on the UK, but both the UK and Europe, I believe, are going to lose from Brexit in this area, in the area of the efficiency of financial services and capital markets, just as they are in many other parts of the economy. And so why do I say that? Two reasons. One is that there will just be less efficiency in the operations of capital markets. They are not going to, London is obviously very efficient. That's why it will maintain a global role, but it will be increasingly pushed out of Europe, partly because of protectionism. Some of the European regulatory moves are designed not so much to strengthen capital markets and strengthen banking regulation as to insist on onshoring. And that is a very different, points in a very different direction in terms of the efficiency of financial intermediation. And also because, as William mentioned, instead of regulatory changes being dominated by the decisions and views of the regulators and supervisors and their experience and their working closely together, there will be political interference. We've just heard how the future will depend on what happens to the Northern Ireland Protocol. That is not the way to decide how to regulate banks for the benefit of the economy and the financial system. So clearly, politics is playing a huge role in this. It played a big role in the Brexit vote, obviously, was a political vote. And it's played a big role also in the EU reaction to the UK. So when I was talking to somebody who was very involved from the Bank of England in Brexit and saying, you know, what is driving the difference, this person was saying, well, it is the politics, both in the UK and in Europe. There is a desire in the UK not to give in to EU regulations when you don't have a seat at the table anymore, because equivalence would have been the simplest way of reducing the economic cost. And then in Europe, there are signs that European policymakers are less willing to grant equivalence or to grant access to the UK than they are, for example, to the US, or maybe even Japan. But in the case of the US can say, you know, if you don't make this easy for our firms, well, we've got a very big market and we can play in that as well. And whereas in the case of the UK, obviously there is a lot of bad feeling. Now, on the substance, I think that the US, it's clear that the US and the UK have got a stronger, better capitalized banking system than in many European countries, ranging from those that are more, where the banking system has been more tied up with a weaker sovereign, and those such as Germany, which have not had this fiscal dominance, but have had a lot of decentralization and so on. So there is a lot to be proud of in the regulatory system of the UK, and a genuine desire not to get pulled down to the European regulation, where there is some suspicion that sometimes rules are set to have maxima rather than minima on strength. And very much with a desire to maintain business within Europe. There is also, this brings me to perhaps the second to last point, which is, well, which UK are we talking about? And William referred to that, contrasting Big Bang 2.0 with the Edinburgh reforms, but there is still a strong So one argument for the UK and the City of London is that it's a very experienced professionals, but also deep capital markets, deep liquid capital markets with strongly tested rules and very strong institutions, good supervisors, and so on and so on. Another argument was the whole Singapore on Thames, and we see some of that actually. It's become, I would say, a bit revealed through the process of the sanctions against Russia and Ukraine, the whole story of London as the kind of facilitator of money laundering, facilitator of perhaps less savory aspects of financial operations. And that strain of, those are very different models for the UK. Does it want to attract business by being the best regulator or amongst the best regulators with deep, open, well-managed markets? Or are there some particular lines of business that may be sort of allowed or facilitated in the UK that are more free-for-all, which I think I got the impression from William, and certainly my view would be that is not the way to go. But there is still a lot of political salience from those who hold that view and maybe who do benefit from that kind of market in Europe. So just what could be done? The simplest thing that could be done is the thing that won't happen, I think, which is, at least it won't happen for a while, which is the EU could just grant equivalence to to UK banks and to UK institutions. The reason it won't happen is that for the EU, that would look like an act of generosity to the country that rejected the EU. And for the UK, it would look like giving up on, instead of being able to set your own rules, you have to abide by other rules when now you're not even at the table to help set them. So I think that would be very difficult. And you may think from a supervisory point of view that those rules are inferior in some ways. The other thing is, could you have an FTA of some kind that would spell out ways of allowing an integration between Europe and the EU on the financial services side?
Free trade agreement, right?
I beg your pardon?
A free trade agreement.
I'm sorry, a free trade agreement. That's right. Yes, no initials. And maybe that's a way forward. I think you'd have to, either of those solutions would have to wait for a calmer moment in UK-EU relations. And for the city, then it depends, can they maintain efficiency and attractiveness as business inevitably drifts elsewhere? Thanks.
Great. Many questions. I'd like to pick up one to start the conversation on equivalence, because you mentioned that, Caroline. Yeah. And maybe ask to both of you that question. I think it's pretty clear that from the point of view of the development of the city, equivalence would probably, I mean, depending, of course, on the conditions and so on and so forth, but would probably in the interest of the City of London and the UK economy. Would it be in the economic interest of the European Union? Maybe William first and Caroline next.
I think the EU equivalence took up a very large part of the discussion that you hosted back in January 2021, because we were still debating how this was all going to end up. And I think what we saw back then, and what I still think is the case, is that the EU will grant equivalence in sectors to the UK as and when it believes that equivalence is in its own economic interest. And right now, it doesn't. And that's primarily the reason as to why the only temporary arrangement that we have when it comes to equivalence is in clearing. Because right now, the EU is not in a position to deal with the potential consequences of not giving equivalence in clearing.
There's an alternative understanding of that, which Caroline hinted at, which is the lack of granting equivalence by the EU is driven by a punitive intent and not by economic interest. So I'd like to have a bit more of your view on that trade-off.
I think that's right. Sorry, just to say that, and obviously you know much more than I do about the developments there, but this time-limited exception of or granting of equivalence is like infant industry, or it's the opposite of infant industry. We're getting ready to have infant industry protections in the EU. I thought Nicolas asked us the question about the economic interests of the EU. I think it's in their economic interests to have efficient trading of derivatives, efficient trading of various other capital market products, which I don't think they will have, at least not until there are some big changes in the way that the EU financial system works. And it would be in their economic interest to allow that efficient trading and to allow equivalence. But I don't think that they see it. I don't think policymakers there see it just as a punitive. I think they definitely see it as a punitive thing, but not only that. I believe, there's a lot of people, just like we're seeing in the United States now, a lot of policymakers think that protectionism is in the interests of the country that puts it in place. I don't think that, but
back to you, William, on the economic interest of equivalence for the EU.
So clearly there is a trade-off between economic interest and a sense of sovereignty. We saw that. I mean, one of the questions that's come up in the Q&A hints at this. Yes, Brexit was self-inflicted, but it was a democratic decision. And a big part of the argument in Brexit was that sovereignty, being able to control things, was more important to many people than raw economic interest, at least until raw economic interest really starts to bite. And we've seen lots of examples. I mean, Japan has a similar approach on clearing, that certain firms in Japan have to clear yen-denominated products onshore. So we've seen the emergence of two markets for Japanese clearing. There is a cost to those firms, and there is therefore a cost to the Japanese financial system. But that is a cost that Japan is prepared to take on the chin in exchange for the sense of oversight and control. I think it clearly is in part a sort of political punishment, but I think there's a bigger issue here on equivalence. That equivalence is not about a sort of balance sheet snapshot. Are you equivalent today? And a huge problem for the EU right now, a huge issue for the EU right now, is that it knows that the UK wants to diverge, but it doesn't yet know where the UK is going to land. So it's very difficult to offer the UK preemptive equivalence when it doesn't know what the UK framework is going to look like. So maybe in a few years' time, we'll be able to revisit this and there will be some equivalence.
I mean, one thing that strikes me is that the referendum was in 2016. The agreement on the whatever it was called was already several years ago. But the dust takes an awful long time to settle, right? I mean, you're alluding, William, to the fact that the EU wants to have visibility on the direction of travel of the UK. But one could have thought that almost 7 years after the referendum, we would have that, but we don't have it, right?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I also think that sovereignty is obviously hugely important and for every country. And that's why, as the world has globalized, and in particular financial markets, there is this debate about how you manage that. And there obviously was a backlash to globalization and a sense that people lost sovereignty and democratic rights. I think, and I wouldn't say that, I'm not sure I agree with your point that sovereignty trumps economic interests. If you remember, the Brexit debate was, there were all those signs on the side of the bus about how much money would go into the National Health Service and so on. So I think there was a strong element of belief, which may have been misguided, that people, that economically, as well as from a sovereignty point of view, people would be better off. And obviously now, if you took that democratic vote, as I understand it, the polls show that there is now a majority of people who think it was a mistake. So it's the kind of thing that just putting a simple vote, maybe it shows the dangers of referenda.
Caroline, on that point specifically, you're right. Sorry, apologies. It's more of a sort of ex post justification. I talked to an awful lot of people today who voted Brexit, who perhaps were in government at some point or advising government at some point in the past few years. A lot of commentators who make this argument. Yes, but of course, I voted for Brexit because I thought that the sovereignty argument was worth the marginal economic hit. To which the response is, yeah, but you didn't have the political courage because perhaps you knew that if you said this is all about sovereignty, and by the way, you'll be a little bit worse off, the vote would have gone the other way. But yes, since the referendum, this argument has emerged that it's worth it, and Nigel Farage and others have been making that argument quite forcefully. But I hesitate to get back into the debate about Brexit itself. We could be here all day.
Yeah, you mentioned the question in the Q&A by Dmitry Gershenson, and he concludes by a question which is, are there lessons for other countries? Maybe, William, you observe the EU a lot. Do you think there is any read across of Brexit and what we see? Of course, Hungary comes to mind, but or any other member state. What is your view of that seen from London 7 years later?
Part of it is that I saw some polling, and I'd have to take this out and share it back with you, Nicola, exactly what it was, but I saw some polling a couple of weeks ago from different member states on support for their own version of Brexit and how that has changed. And since the UK left the EU, support in other member states over the past few years for considering leaving the EU has fallen quite sharply. Has there been a read across in a change in attitude and mindset in Brussels, in European capitals? I'm not sure there's been quite as significant a shift as there perhaps could have been, if I'm not being too diplomatic and too fuzzy. There is a recognition that other member states have quite serious issues with the EU. Perhaps perversely, the experience of the COVID pandemic, the experience more recently of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the pretty united European response to that has actually reinforced and papered over some of those issues. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that sounds right to me, I must say. And one of the things that's that, of course, is not just spite, let's say, but politically important for the EU, the difficulties and challenges for the UK following Brexit. Obviously, it would not have made sense for the EU to facilitate and make it an easier path for the UK, because that would have perhaps made it look a more attractive and possible path for other countries. So there was, seeing what happened to the UK economy, to the city, obviously it's been muddled up by COVID for so long, was in a sense an object lesson that it made sense for the core of the EU to allow to happen, to show the costs, which I think many policymakers probably can see about their own version of leaving, but politically populations might. It's interesting what happened in Italy once the far right got into power. They softened a lot their anti-EU rhetoric. So I think that's a genuinely fair and important point about.
And with Le Pen, in the last few years as well.
Yeah, you wouldn't go so far as saying that the EU voted for Brexit to have this demonstration effect, right?
No. I don't think that. It was the UK that did it.
So I have a lot of questions from the audience, and they're all great questions. So I will ask you to be very succinct in your next responses, because I'd like to go through most, if not all of them. There's the first one from Angus Canvin to William. You mentioned the opportunity cost, and you showed this striking chart suggesting 50,000 job shortfall. But more generally, how do you think in terms of the lost business of Brexit, including in terms of international business. We haven't mentioned China yet, but it will certainly come up. So how do you view that?
I think I'd look at that in two parts. I mean, it's fairly common, and I think not a particularly political point to make in the UK right now, that you look around and sort of nothing really works in the UK. And it's quite hard to argue that all of the time, effort, political capital that has been invested and spent on Brexit in the past 6-7 years couldn't have been put to better use solving other problems, notwithstanding the democratic mandate from the referendum itself. Strictly in terms of business, I don't think we've seen a huge opportunity cost to business, other than the time that Angus and many hundreds, thousands of people across the industry like him have spent a huge amount of time on this that could have been spent more productively on running their business. But broadly speaking, firms are trying to do as much business as they can possibly get away with, as much business that isn't strictly prohibited to be done in London, they will do in London. I think the bigger question is going to be what happens as the dust settles and we perhaps see more business. We will begin to see in the next few years the real cost, the real economic cost to the city of Brexit.
You did mention, William, asset management very briefly in your presentation. Can you update us on picking up on what you just said, on what the current situation and prospects are in these issues of delegation and so on?
So a big concern among parts of the industry, and I should stress it's only parts of the asset management industry, is that the EU will move further and faster on delegation, which is basically the framework that enables an asset management firm anywhere in the world, an asset management firm from outside the EU, to have a range of funds domiciled in the EU, but then delegate the management of those funds back to London, Tokyo, Montreal, or also Toronto or New York. And that the EU somehow wants to sort of force more of that management of assets onshore, to repatriate it. I don't see the EU moving on this in any significant way in the immediate future, not least it would, in trying to address a Brexit-related issue, it would have a knock-on effect on the US, on Japan, and other markets. But there's no doubt that there is, within the EU, there is a core group, a sort of policy group that thinks that if you are managing euro-related assets on behalf of a euro or European client, that management should broadly be done inside the EU. At the moment, they're not in the ascendant, but they may be in future.
Can I just jump in there? What would be the attitude within the US, let's say? You mentioned about Japan, but this kind of delegation, is it a particular question for Europe because there is growing business there? It is an economic entity, but it doesn't quite have the capital markets to match its economy?
It's actually a rare example of the EU being a global success story in this particular market. UCITS, the investment fund regulatory framework, is effectively a global product, and an awful lot of investment funds in the EU are domiciled in the EU but managed around the world, whether that's being managed back in Boston or wherever. The US would take Nicola can answer this better than I can, but would, I think, take an extremely negative view, let's say, if the EU were to try to address this global system of delegation that would effectively require a US asset manager that has funds domiciled in the EU to relocate the asset managers from Boston or New York or wherever to Dublin, Luxembourg, or Paris. That is not going to go down very well. But I think Nicola probably has a a clearer view on that, or
I don't know if I don't know if extremely negative view counts as a British understatement. I have a question to you, Caroline, from Ignazio Angeloni, who, of course, was one of the founders of European banking supervision at the ECB. And he's asking you, are you sure that UK banks are better capitalized than Euro area banks? Not my impression, he says, quality and quantity-wise. So what do you have to say on that?
Well, I hesitate to disagree given your background and expertise, but I think that the market certainly judges that that UK and US banks have survived various problems in a more robust way than many European banks. And I'm glad to say that I see William nodding. And it does not to say that there can be no problems, but the stress tests are more robust, I think, and just the general attitude has been not so much how can we get away with less capitalization, but how can we have strong capitalization as a competitive winning point rather than...
To be clear, you don't think that's the mindset of the ECB as a supervisor?
I'm not... I'm sorry, I didn't catch that, Nicolas, but...
I mean, you're implying that the UK views strong capital as an asset and not a problem, but by contrast, that's not the case of the ECB, which is now the main banking supervisor in the EU.
Yes, I think that every supervisor is affected by the system that they've begun to supervise. The ECB is a relatively new supervisor, and it builds on top of many different supervisory regimes across Europe, some of which were stronger than others. And I think we've seen that over history.
I have a couple of questions about the numbers that William showed in terms of who's moving where. So Mark Tokola is asking, why is Dublin drawing so much post-Brexit activity from London? Is it simply a matter of language? Is it a matter of incentives? Ulf Dahlsten has been asking whether these actually matter, or if I get his question right, if they're basically letterbox businesses. So you gave the number of entities, but not the corresponding jobs because there is no data for that. Can you give us a bit more of a qualitative sense?
Yeah, so on the Dublin, the number of moves to Dublin, first and foremost, it's important to recognize this is just the number of firms that we identified moving. When you overlay that with Dublin's specialization in investment funds, the vast majority, so not the vast majority, the majority of the moves to Dublin are asset management investment funds, which will tend to be sort of smaller in scale in terms of number of people being moved. The reason we chose firms relocating was that it's the only thing where we have any consistency comparing individual financial centers. There is no up-to-date data on the assets on the move and no up-to-date data on the jobs on the move. But that's where I say where what I suspect where this has been going is that Dublin, as I say, will be the winner, for want of a better word, when it comes to the number of firms moving. Frankfurt by assets, because we are beginning to be able to measure those assets on the move, and the majority of them are going to Frankfurt. And what we're seeing is that a lot of firms are putting Frankfurt as their European or their EU headquarters. Because once they're headquartered in Frankfurt, they can locate their staff anywhere they want. And they're primarily choosing to put those staff in Paris.
In a way, how much does that matter? I mean, if the assets are booked in Frankfurt, does that give any tangible advantage to Frankfurt or Germany compared to those assets being booked in Luxembourg or Paris? Can you give us a sense of that?
Other than supervisory bragging rights and supervisory risk, no, I don't think so. The ultimate metric, the ultimate measure of who has been the biggest beneficiary, which financial center has been the biggest beneficiary from Brexit, is going to be in terms of jobs. And that looks like it's going to be Paris.
The spillover to the rest of, and both that as a measure of how much work is being done in this industry, but also the spillover to the rest of the local economies there. That's what presumably, which is very interesting. Can I just put in, how much difference does the pandemic and working from home make to all of this? Because I know in the US, there is still a lot of remote work, hybrid work, perhaps less so in the financial sector than in many other sectors.
And to that, I will add the question asked by Per Wissen, William, which is whether we still need large financial centers in a world of big data, AI, cloud computing, in addition to work from home.
I think my answer to that would be yes, but a qualified yes. I mean, a good example here is when we talk about financial centers, what exactly do we mean? One of the highest profile numbers or examples that's been used in the media in the UK since Brexit is the shift in EU 27 equity trading from London to the EU. It's a big number. I mean, it's trillions of euros a year. It's probably involved maybe a few dozen people actually moving. I mean, what's happened is that a switch has been pressed in London that officially relocates, diverts these messages to a server in Amsterdam. Now, if those servers had moved from London to Dublin during the period in which the UK was part of the EU, I don't think anybody would suddenly be talking about Dublin being the financial center for equities trading. So there is a degree of sort of ethereal fungibility around where these things traded. Yes, a big chunk of euro-denominated derivatives is now officially being traded in Frankfurt. But what does that actually mean? Are the people doing the trading in Frankfurt? Probably not. Are the clients behind that in Frankfurt? No. It's sort of, is it being booked there? Is it being done there? And these are questions that the supervisors in the industry are going to have to grapple with more, particularly as we see advances in technology, AI, digitization, alongside working from home. But on the working from home side, I agree with Caroline. If financial services does seem to be an industry where the willingness to accept hybrid working and regular working from home, other than in strictly sort of support functions, is not very high. I was in Canary Wharf this morning. It was absolutely rammed.
And there's also working from Warsaw. If you go to Poland these days, you will see a lot of towers popping up on the skyline of Warsaw, and a lot of those jobs are financial services. So there's also this dynamic of back office and shoring. By the way, Caroline, Ignacio, for the record, is basically siding with you. He says, I was among the few thinking that your area bank should continue building capital after 2016, as they had done in 13 to 16. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So on the point. There's a question from, let me zoom a bit out as we are getting, unfortunately, closer to the end of that conversation, but not yet. Elliot Posner is asking how Brexit has affected international standard setting in the Financial Stability Board, Basel Committee, etc. Caroline, you have followed these processes very closely, and indeed you have already come to financial statements to comment on them. What's your view of that? In a way, it's a complicated question.
Yes, I think that the experts and the central bankers, regulators probably maintain a close and professional relationships, friendships. They're concerned about strength in their systems more than they are about the politics. But we know that ministries of finance and even politicians, I well remember Chancellor Merkel being very involved in describing how the Financial Stability Board should look at shadow banking and other things that she elevated to leader levels, and no other leader really wanted to get into the issue of what shadow banks were, so her language went forward. So I'm sure that within the FSB and so on, it has to have an impact that there are these tensions between the UK and the EU, but I suspect it's the place where there is the least impact, rather than in the more political bodies or amongst Sherpas and so on. There will be a general aim of reaching agreement that is going to be in the interests of the global financial system. They may feel a little bit more pressured from outside by the stormy politics.
William, is that something you look at?
It's not something we've looked at in great detail. That there is, I think there is potentially an opportunity in this area for the UK. I mean, you might have guessed I'm not a sort of flag-waving Brexiter, but there are opportunities as well as imperatives that come from Brexit. And I think that one of those opportunities is for the UK in markets where it has significant scale already. I think there is a genuine opportunity to work with other significant markets and help directly shape global standards. We did some work on this last year with your friends across the road at the Atlantic Council, Nicolas. If you put the UK and US together in markets where they are either first or second globally, you have about 10 or 11 markets where they are de facto the global market. And I think there is an opportunity for the UK to work more closely with the US and with other partners in other areas in these international forums. But I wouldn't know.
Is there appetite for that in the US, Caroline? I mean, the US has to deal with this relationship between the UK and the EU. Obviously, the UK is closer. There's this trust, this depth of the relationship, same language. The EU is also bigger. So if you're in the White House right now, which you have been, how do you look at this kind of balancing act?
I think it's a tricky balancing act. And luckily, the regulators and supervisors will be somewhat insulated from those politics, because I think the politics, and especially if we look at the Ukraine war, obviously the UK has been, just to shift to a completely different arena, the UK has been very forward-leaning along with the US in supporting Ukraine, but that isn't really what has mattered. What has mattered is Germany and the rest of the EU. And if we think of the relationship with China, which was also a very important thing, the US really wants Germany and the rest of the EU to be, and Amsterdam and so on, to be joining with it. So maybe it goes back to what William was saying about things not looking that great internally in the UK now. And so the voice, the bigger political voice, I think, has definitely weakened, which is not to say that, everybody wouldn't still say the special relationship and so on. However, within the, so it sort of depends how much the US and the UK regulators and supervisors can work together within the Financial Stability Board, within the G20, and be somewhat insulated from the politics as they develop regulatory standards and promote those. And it's very much in the interests, I think, of both countries and both of their capital markets to do that. I don't think the politics will help.
On the point that you were mentioning, William, of this kind of global landscape of financial centers, of course, a big event of the last few years has been the, let's say, challenges encountered by Hong Kong. Do you view that as an offsetting factor for London? In a way, can London gain from Hong Kong what it's losing from Brexit? How do you look at that?
No, it can't. London may benefit some, London may pick up some incremental business that might otherwise have gone to Hong Kong. I'm wary of commenting exactly on how much business has Hong Kong has, or how much of a direct business impact events have had on Hong Kong until we can actually drill down a little more into the numbers. But what seems to be the case so far is that the main beneficiary from Hong Kong's challenges has been Singapore. Yeah. And the sheer, it's a classic. It's a numbers game. Even if the UK were to take, 20% of Hong Kong's business, that's only going to that's only going to make up for a relatively small proportion of business that the UK has lost to the EU.
Yeah, I would also say that it's interesting to me that maybe 5 years ago, or as the pressures on Hong Kong were growing, I think, or maybe before they got quite so acute, I think there was a general expectation that there would be a shift to Shanghai, maybe even as much as or more than Singapore. But developments in the last, really during COVID and during President Xi's sort of shift to a third term, have made Shanghai less attractive. And again, Singapore has been the beneficiary of that.
And there was some sense a year ago that perhaps London might benefit from the sort of the geopolitical tensions between the US and China, and that maybe some of that business could come in the direction of London. But the relationship between the UK and China is significantly less positive today than perhaps it was when people were entertaining that possibility.
Red carpet.
Yes. Singapore looks more like the ground in the middle than London right now. Okay, we have two questions which are very broad and deep at the same time. One from Nick Collier, the other from Martin Helvig. So and I apologize to others, Megra Shah, Jacqueline Mills, that we Vinay Sharma, that we won't have time for theirs. But Martin is reminding us that the EU is about more than trade, and it's really about the regulation and the behind the borders arrangements, and he's asking whether there's any scope for an agreement that would allow for kind of dynamic coordination on regulation, going back to your image, William, of parallel divergence. And Nick Collier is asking about the stable equilibrium 5 years from now. So if we think that the dust will have settled by then, will it be more like Japan with a mix of on and offshore, more like the EU-US relationship with no real cross-border access in his view? So basically medium to long-term questions on the nature of the relationship. Maybe William first and then Caroline.
So I tend to side here with I think Nick is pretty much on the money there. I think there will be, I don't see a particularly in-depth, sophisticated, dynamic relationship between the UK and EU in future. I think there will be polite conversations and regular structured discussions. There might be a little bit more coordination on timing. I like to think that there is somebody, and I'm promised that there is not, but I like to think that there's somebody sitting in Brussels in a cupboard, totting up how much business has moved in different sectors from the UK to the EU, and that at some point it's going to hit a particular level, and he or she is going to run down the corridor to the relevant commission and say, okay, enough. Because I do get the sense that actually that's sort of what the EU wants. There is a degree of repatriation that it wants here. Business that a lot of people in Europe, in the EU, think should never have been allowed to go to London in the first place. Once a degree of that has come back, I think we could see a much more constructive, passive relationship.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting note. I think the medium term, that I'm going to be optimistic, the medium term would be more like a US EU than a Japan one. It would be more free-flowing and benefiting from sort of race to the top rather than the bottom between regulators and supervisors, and a bit less of the ideas in the UK of Singapore on Thames. Let's have that sort of free-for-all in the UK, and a little less of the it's our businesses, so we want our money in our countries in the case of the EU. And in both cases, more of an interest in having, let's have the strongest, best financial system. And by the way, that means working together quite closely and understanding different strengths and weaknesses. So that's my hope for where it is in 5 years' time.
On this sunny note, I want to thank very warmly both both Caroline Atkinson and William Wright, for a very wide-ranging conversation. I think we couldn't answer all questions, and I see Uday Birdas as a new one in the Q&A. Unfortunately, that will be for a future session. And the next session indeed will be on February 8th. We will have a conversation on liquidity, systemic liquidity risk, and what we've learned from recent episodes, not just in March 2020 or in the UK in September 2022 indeed, but also a number of other cases with Raghuram Rajan, which of course is a former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, and Megan Green, who is a very significant market observer and financial market participant. So see you there, hopefully. And in the meantime, again, very warm thanks to William and Caroline for a very thought-provoking conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.